Greetings again, philosophers. We've got week 3 recap here, ONeal low-tech video. In week 3, we looked primarily at two of the most important philosophers in the history of Western thought. We looked at Plato and Aristotle. And so I kind of want to refocus on a couple of their key ideas and launch us forward into week 4 as we kind of go forward here. So first, on Plato, you might recall that I said that we need to understand Plato as trying to put a metaphysical and epistemological base underneath Socrates' ethics. So we were working with that kind of pyramid idea with metaphysics at the bottom, and then epistemology, and then ethics on top of that. Socrates and Plato, they agree about their ethics, they agree about virtue, they agree that the unexamined life isn't worth living, and they agree about what justice is and how righteousness ought to be lived out. So at that top level, at the level of virtue, they're all the same. But Socrates never really provided a good metaphysical foundation for that, and never helped us understand how that metaphysic tied in with his idea of virtue. And so Plato is the great systematizer. He puts together this system that then will support Socrates' ethics. And he does it in a way where we're able to see this connection between metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. So I've given the quick summary here on the board behind me, and let me just kind of talk you through this a little bit. Maybe this will help bring some of these things to light. Kind of starting at the top of the pyramid with the question of ethics. Up here then, Plato says that virtue is best understood as a matter of goodness, right? So the most important quality is goodness, and goodness really informs everything else. He says it's like the sun. We get our light, or that is our understanding. We draw our life from the sun, and so he has this analogy of the sun as a form or a model of what the good is, and even calls it the good. And so this is the most important feature of Plato's picture of reality. Thinking also about epistemology for a second, he describes a divided line, and so I've put this divided line across the bottom of the board here, a line that's divided between, say, knowledge on one side and opinions and beliefs on the other. Actually, he has some subdivisions, but the key thing is that there's a difference between knowledge and between opinions, even if they're correct opinions, beliefs, even if they're correct beliefs, they're not necessarily knowledge. And so the question is, what counts as knowledge? When do we know something as opposed to just believing something that happens to be true or having an opinion about something that might be true or might be false? And so that's a pretty key division. We could kind of think of it as like a file cabinet where we've got these things in our minds and we're trying to file them. Do they go in the knowledge file? Do they go in the belief file? Do they go in the opinion file? Obviously, this is the strongest position, to claim to know something as opposed to merely believe it or have an opinion about it. And so that's his analogy of the divided line. Don't forget it. I'll come back to it. But then his most famous analogy is this analogy of the cave. And so it takes me a little minute to sketch it out, so I did this in advance. So this is kind of a rough version, bad art, sorry, of Plato's diagram of the cave. And let me just notice a couple of the important features for you here. The way Plato tells the story, we've got some prisoners chained to a wall, and they spend their lives staring at another wall, like a giant IMAX theater or something. And on this wall, this big screen, are shadows that move across the wall. These shadows are made by someone standing back here behind carrying statues or artifacts around in front of a big bonfire, and so the fire casts a shadow on the wall. And Plato tells a much more nuanced and detailed version of the story, but his point is that the common man is like this person chained to the wall. They don't know any better. They are they happy? Well, I mean, they have their own little society. Some of them are really good at recognizing shadows and predicting what's going to come next, and so they get the esteem of their colleagues, so they're happy. Some of these people are bad at predicting shadows. They don't have this kind of social esteem, so they're unhappy. So they don't know anything different. They don't have anything to compare it to. So they have a whole range of happiness based on their relationship then with these shadows. Now Plato were to speculate, well, what if we were to take one of these guys off the wall, maybe the grand champion shadow predictor, say, and he were to be turned loose inside this cave? He would undergo some change, right? First of all, the fire would hurt his eyes, and it would take his eyes some time to adjust. Eventually, he would begin to compare these things. He'd have started off thinking, well, this is the real bunny. I've known my whole life what a bunny is. And this is the statue of a bunny, or not the statue, this is a copy of a bunny, or something that looks like a bunny. By the way, Plato doesn't mention bunnies. It's just the only thing I can draw that you might recognize. So he's just vague, artifacts, but we'll think bunnies. So this is a copy of a bunny, but then he begins to compare them, and he realizes that actually this one is more real than this one, right? There's a connection between them. When this one moves, this one moves. When this one moves, that one moves. So there's all that, but you know, if the statue gets set down here behind the wall, the statue still exists, but the shadow goes away. And so he starts to think, well, wait a minute. I think the statue is the real bunny, and this thing is the fake bunny. And so he kind of completes that transformation. But Plato can't leave well enough alone, and so he says, well, what if we were to drag him up this long, difficult path to the world outside the cave, where, you know, we've got the bright sunshine, we've got trees, we've got ponds, and we've got real live bunnies. Initially, he would have the same experiences of pain and frustration. He wouldn't be able to walk around during the daylight. He'd have to go around at night. He'd have to look at the reflection of things in the pond. But eventually his eyes would adjust, he would adapt, and he'd begin to understand this world out here. And he'd be able to look at bunnies. And eventually he'd even be able to look at the sun itself, and he'd be able to stare directly at it. And then he would be kind of fully realized as a human person. That would be like the best he could possibly be when he got to that state. And the sun has the same role in the cave. It is the epitome of goodness. That's the goal, to see the good, to understand the good, to live in light of the good. Plato doesn't end the story there. He drags the fellow back inside and puts him back on the wall. Now he's no good at predicting shadows. He's no good at anticipating what's going to happen next. His former friends think that he's ruined. He's not good for anything valuable, not good for anything important. He's frustrated. He can't explain his experiences because they don't have any categories for it. And so he eventually tries to lead a rebellion. He says, well, the only way I'm going to make you understand is if I can get you off the wall and help you to have the same experience as I had, which they resist completely. They don't want to do that because obviously whatever happened to him ruined him, and they don't want to be like him. So Plato says, well, they'll kill him if they have to. And this isn't subtle, right? I mean, he's clearly talking about how the people of Athens killed Socrates because he threatened them with a description of reality that wasn't what they were used to. Well, that's the super fast version of Plato's Cave, but by way of a couple of points of application, part of what Plato is doing is he is trying to synthesize some of the earlier philosophies that we've seen so far. For example, he says that the world inside the cave is the world of sensation, where we use our senses and where things are in a state of constant change. That is, he says, Heraclitus is right, as long as we understand that he's just talking about things inside the cave. On the other hand, the world outside the cave, this is what Plato calls the world of the forms, or the world of the ideas, and this is where everything is perfect, ideal. That's the relationship to idea, ideal, and it's unchanging. And then he says, well, this is the world of Parmenides. This is what Parmenides was talking about. Now, Plato is ultimately more like Parmenides than he is like Heraclitus. And so he says it's only in this world, the world of the forms, the world of the ideals, that we can have genuine knowledge, because these are the sorts of things that we can discover through reason. That's this long, difficult pathway, the pathway of philosophy. We can learn these things by reason, and since they stay put, they're not going to change, and so our knowledge isn't going to change along the way. So this actually corresponds to the line that I drew here at the bottom. According to Plato, knowledge is always knowledge of the forms. Right? Those are the only things that we can know. When we're talking about components of our experience, we're just talking about our opinions or our beliefs, because these things might change, so we could be wrong, because we're trusting our senses, which sometimes deceives us, and so we just can't be making the same kind of strong claims about knowledge that we did when we were outside the cave talking about the forms. And this also kind of reflects this difference between matter and immaterial, between body and soul, or body and spirit, that some of you were discussing in the discussion boards, the materialism versus the immaterialism that Plato sort of brought about, and that the Christian tradition has, in a lot of respects, followed. As a matter of fact, this week we're going to look at Augustine, not on the same issue, but Augustine basically baptizes Plato, gets rid of one of the O's in the good, and says, this is how we relate to God. God is this ultimate standard, and to know him, to observe him, to look at him is perfect humanity, ideal humanity, and that's what we should pursue. So anyway, Plato is really key, and we're going to make some reference to him later on, so kind of wanted to give you the picture to go along with Plato. Some other time maybe I'll say a little bit more about Aristotle, but for now, just kind of looking ahead, this coming week is going to focus us on some issues in philosophy of religion, speaking of God. We're going to have some folks who continue to prefer reason, namely Augustine and Anselm, and the way they employ reason are either defending Christianity against attacks or trying to justify belief in Christian theism. And we'll look at some famous arguments there. Augustine's defense against evil, Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God, as well as Aquinas, a later Christian theologian who was more like Aristotle. I mean, in the same way that Augustine baptizes Plato, Aquinas basically baptizes Aristotle. And so he employs similar methodology. He accepts the testimony of his senses as a good starting place for doing theology. And so he produces arguments for the existence of God that start with experience and then move upward to belief in God. These arguments are still with us in various forms today in the mouths of Christian preachers and apologists and philosophers. So one of the things we'll be deciding is, are those good arguments, and are they still useful to us? Anyway, trust that this is not only encouraging to you, but also somewhat instructive. And in this coming week, while we do some issues that are near and dear to the minds and hearts of Christians, I trust that you'll really be encouraged and kind of built up spiritually as you think about the application of our minds to right thinking about who God is and how we can know him. Until then, God bless you, and we'll press forward to finish this first half of the course.